Thank you very much for the introduction. And let me first express my thanks to Kyoto University and in particular Professor Yasuko Takezawa for inviting me and organizing this very important symposium. I'd like to start by looking at some statistics from the U.S., most recent U.S. Census from 2010. What we've learned from this census, number one, is that there has been a huge growth in the number of multiracial individuals. The other big surprising thing from the census was that Asians were seen to be the largest racial or ethnic group, growing from the past census taken in the year 2000. And within the category of Asians, the census has these categories called Asians in combination, meaning multiracial Asians, and Asians alone, or monoracial Asians. And multiracial Asians are growing faster than Asians alone. In particular, among Asian Americans, Japanese Americans have historically had very high rates of outmarriage. This has led to a situation today when it has become rare to find Japanese American families without any mixed-race members. Indeed, the census data shows that out of the 1.3 million Japanese Americans, more than 460,000 define themselves as multiracial, a number growing at such a pace that by the next census count in 2020, the Japanese American community will be majority multiracial. This narrative of an increasingly multiracial Japanese America is relatively well known. But multiracial Japanese Americans have also played a significant role in the community's history. In other words, rather than understand Japanese Americans as originally pure in its beginnings and increasingly hybrid in recent days, my presentation today argues that mixedness has been a feature of this community from its earliest beginnings and throughout the course of its development. So my first point today is that unlike the many Japanese who sojourned to the Americas as laborers, students, and businessmen for relatively short periods, the first Japanese Americans, the first Japanese who put down roots and permanently settled as migrants in Hawaii, California, and Oregon, were all involved in multiracial families. The mass migration of the Japanese began in earnest in 1868, when the first group of 153 laborers emigrated to Hawaii on the British ship the Kyoto. The group left Japan without official sanction from the shogunate for the purpose of working on Hawaii's sugar plantations. They were later dubbed the Gannen Mono because they were people, mono, who had left in the first year, Gannen, of the newly established Meiji government, which secured power a few months after their departure. In Hawaii, the 12-hour workdays on the sugar plantations, the wretched housing conditions, the language barriers with the plantation overseers, and the mistreatment of laborers proved too much for many in the group to endure. And only a small handful of this initial group actually permanently settled in Hawaii. Among them were men like Matsugoro Kuwata, who you see up here on the slide, Tokujiro Sato, and Toyokichi Fukumura, all of whom married and had children with local Hawaiian women. The children of the union of the Gannen Mono Japanese men and native Hawaiian women were Hapa Japanese Hawaiians who represented the first Japanese born in this new land. Hapa being a term used in Hawaii to denote those of mixed Hawaiian heritage. For example, Hapa Haole were mixed Hawaiian or white Haole individuals. One of the Gannen Mono fathers was Toyokichi Fukumura, a samurai who had left Japan with this first group of Japanese migrants because he had fought on the side of the shogunate, and with the restoration of the emperor, was fearful of persecution by imperial forces. Torakichi married a Hawaiian woman, Kaha Lu'ukai, and had 2 children, Solomon and Mary. Other Ganden mono who married native Hawaiians were Matsugoro Kuwada, a tailor on Maui, who married Meleana Awe-Kulani, and Tokujiro Sato on the Big Island, who married Kalala Lamekona. Thus, the first permanent Japanese-American population in the Hawaiian Islands was almost entirely multiracial. In Hawaii, still a sovereign nation at this time, prior to U.S. annexation, multiracial encounters and unions were common in a way quite different from North America. Indeed, interracial unions were frequent. Torakichi Fukumura's Hapa-Japanese son Solomon, who I mentioned a moment ago, married another mixed-race individual, the Hawaiian-German mixed-race woman, Mine Hines, and had 6 children with her. The tone for this openness to mixedness had been set by the Hawaiian king Kalakaua's thought that racial intermarriage would be key to revitalizing the recently decimated Hawaiian population. Indeed, in 1881, the king went as far as to propose to the Japanese emperor that a union take place between his 6-year-old niece, Princess Kauilulani, and the Japanese prince Yamashina Sadamaro. And while Japanese-Hawaiian relations improved because of gestures like this, this particular royal union did not come to pass. So moving on from Hawaii now to the mainland U.S., the first Japanese there were also marked by multiracial families. The first Japanese family to settle in California was that of John Henry Schnell and his wife. Schnell was a Prussian national who had arrived in Japan prior to the Meiji Restoration under the auspices of the Dutch to deal in arms sales to the shogunate allied forces. His elder brother, Edward Schnell, consulted with the shogunate and served as a translator for the Prussian consulate. And this younger brother, John, had come under the direct employee of Lord Matsudaira of the Aizu domain and was given status as a samurai. John had been given permission to marry a Japanese woman from the samurai class, Oyo, and then he proposed to Lord Matsudaira that his then pregnant wife and a group from the Aizu Wakamatsu region emigrate to California and establish a colony. With Lord Matsudaira's consent and funding, in April 1869, Schnell commissioned the steam-powered clipper ship, the SS China, to carry his wife, their first child, Francis, their nursemaid, Okei, and 20 farmers and craftsmen to the U.S. And on the left here, you can see this is a famous painting by Henry Sugimoto of this first Japanese settlement in North America called the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony in 1869. Unfortunately, the colony was a failure, and after 2 years, Schnell returned to Japan with his wife and 2 daughters. But in this experiment, we can see that the first Japanese community to develop was a multiracial one. And we see this further with one of the colonists, 20-year-old carpenter. He's one of the other people that came on the boat, Kuninosuke Masuzumi, who married Carrie Wilson, the daughter of a Blackfoot Indian woman and a former African-American slave, in 1877. He was the only one in the colony to permanently settle in the United States and raise a family. This couple had 3 children, and their descendants, the present-day Ellebeck family, were discovered when a local newspaper ran a story on the 100th year anniversary of the Wakamatsu colony. The Ellebeck family members today, including Masamizu's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, consider themselves generally African American, but in recent years have also referred to themselves as the Black Samurai. Finally, on the right-hand side of the slide, the first Japanese to settle in Oregon were also members of a multiracial family. Mio Iwakoshi arrived in 1880 with her Australian-Scottish husband, Andrew McKinnock, their adopted 5-year-old daughter, Tama Jewel Nitobe, and her brother, Riki. The couple had met in Japan, where at the invitation of the Japanese government, McKinnock had been teaching the Japanese new animal husbandry techniques for raising cattle and dairy farming in Hokkaido as part of a Japanese government campaign to learn from Western expertise that ultimately brought 10,000 so-called oyatoi gaikokujin, or hired foreign specialists, to the island nation. The Iwakoshi McKinnock couple was among the many interracial couples that resulted from this effort to modernize Japan. The couple set up a sawmill in East Multnomah County, outside of present-day Portland, that McKinnock eventually named after his wife. The settlement was called Orient, and the community of Orient still exists as a small township outside of the Portland suburb of Gresham, Oregon. So this is my first point today. Very few people in Japanese American studies have noticed that, in fact, the very earliest of Japanese peoples in the Americas were multiracial. But my second point is that in addition to this very early pioneering work, multiracial persons and families were very much involved in the history and community development of Japanese America. And the key issue that they most focused on, as can be imagined, was labor. So certainly labor in the Hawaiian sugar plantations increased when roughly 30,000 Japanese, the so-called kanyaku imin, the contract migrants to Hawaii, moved to those island nations to work on the sugar plantations. Accompanying the first official group of 943 Japanese contract laborers aboard the steamship City of Tokyo in 1885 was Robert Walker Irwin, the Kingdom of Hawaii's minister to Japan. Irwin ended up being critical to the negotiation of the treaty signed a year after the City of Tokyo's arrival between the two nations that permitted the mass migration of Japanese, including his own Japanese wife, Takechi Iki. Their marriage in 1882 had been arranged by the Japanese foreign minister, Kaoru Inoue, and this constituted the first legal marriage between an American and a Japanese citizen. There are 6 children, including their oldest daughter, Bella, who later founded the Irwin Gakuin School in Tokyo, are among the earliest Hapa Japanese Americans. Another key multiracial Japanese American in the community's labor history was Fred Kinzaburo Makino. He was born in Yokohama in 1887 as the third son to his Japanese, that's his mother and father, mother Kin Makino, and British silk merchant Joseph Higginbotham. When he moved to Hawaii, he established the Makino drugstore in Honolulu in 1901, one of the first Japanese-owned stores in the city, 2 years after emigrating there. His involvement in Honolulu's Japanese community extended beyond his small business, as he served as the official lawyer for many Japanese who faced problems ranging from immigration to marital legal issues. His skills would eventually lead him to represent the Japanese community, especially in the labor issues that plagued the majority of the Japanese migrants who worked on the sugar plantations where racially discriminatory work conditions provoked numerous labor strikes. For instance, the Higher Wage Association elected Makino president during the 1909 Oahu plantation strike, and you see on the slide there on the right side four gentlemen who were jailed as part of that strike, and that's Makino on the top right side. He was jailed for 4 months for his role in the labor movement. Though mixed race, Makino's stature in the Japanese community only increased when in 1912 he founded one of the most influential and long-lasting ethnic newspapers, the Hawaii Hochi. Through the newspaper, Makino expressed community sentiment around labor issues, including the biggest 1919 strike, immigration issues, citizenship issues, and the Japanese language school cases that resulted in a U.S. Supreme Court victory for these schools. Makino's history provides clear evidence that the earliest Japanese-American community in Hawaii generally viewed multiraciality in a positive light, and that mixed-race individuals could be advocates for and representatives of Japanese America. The move towards racial purity and exclusion, though, especially on the mainland, meant that not only that virtually no Japanese could naturalize as U.S. citizens, but that even mixed-race Japanese, some of whom were at least partially white, also found themselves unable to lay claim to national belonging in America. These laws impacted many who had naturalized as U.S. citizens in 1898, when all residents of Hawaii automatically earned American citizenship upon the transfer of the Hawaiian Islands as American territory. And this included Joe Makino, the older brother of Fred Makino. Joe was stripped of his citizenship in New York when he moved there, when authorities learned of his half-Japanese heritage. He took his case to a New York state court, but lost. Similarly, William Knight, despite having served in the U.S. Navy for over 25 years and receiving a medal in the Battle of Manila Bay, found himself in front of Judge Thomas Chatfield of the U.S. District Court in 1909, who denied his application to naturalize as an American citizen, stating that because his mother was half Japanese and half Chinese, he was literally, this is the quote, literally a half-breed, and the application must be denied. Another mixed-race Japanese who took his case for U.S. citizenship to court was Albert Henry Young, who, as half Japanese and half German, was denied his U.S. naturalization by federal district court Judge Cushman of Washington State in 1912. Judge Cushman, in his opinion, noted, and this is a quote, "In the abstraction of higher mathematics, it may be plausibly said that half of infinity is equal to the whole of infinity. But in the case of such a concrete thing as a person, of a human being, it cannot be said that one who is half white and half brown or yellow is a white person as commonly understood." And this echoes some of the things Professor Gross was talking about yesterday about common sense and common understanding. These legal determinations, prior to the better-known 1922 United States versus Ozawa case that Professor Gross mentioned yesterday, made it clear that those with even partial Japanese heritage were not going to be included in the national citizenry. And here, I'm not going to read all of this, but we can see a range of views on miscegenation or racial mixture. We should note here that as early as 1880, the California Civil Code explicitly forbade the issuance of marriage licenses to couples consisting of a white person and a, quote, Negro, mulatto, or Mongolian. And in the 4 decades that followed, virtually every Western state, except Colorado, had passed similar what are called anti-miscegenation laws that had their roots in the southern U.S. tradition of prohibiting marriage and integration between whites and blacks, but with, this time, Asians, otherwise known in that period as Orientals or Mongolians, as the primary target of these laws. In Idaho, for example, the state statute already included a ban on white Mongolian marriages, a term which seemed to them to only refer to the Chinese. And so this law was amended in 1922 with the explicit addition of Japanese to the list of persons illegal for white Americans to marry. And by that same year, 1922, even the federal government became involved after the passage of the Cable Act, which stripped American citizenship from women who married a so-called alien ineligible to citizenship, an expression that was most often a coded reference to Asians. These laws impacted mixed-race couples such as Junjiro Aoki and Gladys Emery Aoki, who you see in the picture there, who left California to marry in Washington State in 1909, or Fusataro Nakaya and Edith W. Morton, who went as far as Mexico to sanctify their marriage in 1921. And what you see up here on the slide here, it's on the right-hand side, it's in Spanish. It's their marriage certificate in Mexico. And on the left, after she challenged the Cable Act to regain her U.S. citizenship after it was stripped, she finally was able, this is the certificate on the left-hand side of Mrs. Morton, who regained her U.S. citizenship after having lost it because she married a Japanese. So one of the other kind of point I wanted to make in this presentation is that generally speaking, we have this image, especially in the post-war period, of American GIs and Japanese women, or this kind of Western man, Japanese woman relationship. And what I wanted to kind of bring up today was that when we look at this carefully, especially prior to the so-called picture bride era, you see a lot of Japanese men marrying Caucasian or Mexican or non-Japanese women in the Americas. And one of the most famous products of such a marriage between a Japanese man, the writer Yone Noguchi, and the educator, Irish-American educator and journalist Leonie Gilmore was their son, Isamu Noguchi, who identified himself as a so-called hybrid Japanese-American who would, in later years, become an internationally celebrated sculptor, architect, and furniture designer. And I think out there in the hall, you'll see there's a poster session out there focused on Noguchi. Finally, as the final point of my presentation, let me say a word about how mixed-race Japanese Americans had to confront the realities of World War II when Japan and the United States went to war. There's this quote you'll see on the slide up there by Colonel Bendiston. "I am determined that if they have one blood of Japanese blood in them, they must go to camp." Carl Bendiston was one of the key architects of the U.S. government's policy of rounding up and incarcerating nearly 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. Here, suggesting how the notion of one drop defined the non-white other and how that got heightened during World War II. In this case, one drop of Japanese blood was enough to define Japanese Americans as the enemy in the months after Pearl Harbor, and in the February 1942 Executive Order 9066 issued by President Roosevelt that defined the military zone from which all persons of Japanese ancestry were to be removed. Despite being at war with Germany and Italy as well as Japan, the U.S. government's wholesale targeting of all Japanese Americans, even those with only a single drop of blood, was selectively targeting small numbers of German and Italian Americans with particular ties to Nazi or fascist organizations, while targeting all Japanese Americans, thus demonstrating the racially biased policies of the U.S. government. These Japanese Americans lost their homes, businesses, properties, and communities when they relocated to high-security camps run by the Department of Justice or to one of the 10 camps run by the War Relocation Authority. In time, the government would issue a policy that would make an exception to the one-drop rule by exempting those with less than 50% Japanese blood from the relocation policy, though such exceptions were rarely put into practice. For example, 120 Alaskans, most of whom were children or grandchildren of Eskimo women and Japanese men, were forcibly removed to the Minidoka camp in Idaho, and they were all removed without exception. Hundreds, perhaps even over 1,000 mixed marriage families existed in the West Coast area as of October 1943, according to U.S. government documents. This situation threatened to tear families apart, as the non-Japanese parent had to decide whether to voluntarily enter camp with the rest of the family. And these persons without Japanese ancestry who voluntarily entered these World War II camps included Mary Kimura, and you see a little quote there from one of her neighbors, a Portuguese woman who had married into a Japanese-American family that ended up in the Topaz camp, and Estelle Ishigo, a Euro-American woman who lost her job at the Hollywood Art Center after Pearl Harbor because of her Japanese family name. And you see one of Estelle Ishigo's sketches, two of them on the slide there. Among the many ways in which the U.S. government miscalculated the loyalty of Japanese American families to America, perhaps the most egregious example of this racially biased policy can be seen in the incarceration of young children from the various orphanages on the West Coast and their placement behind barbed wire at the Manzanar WRA camp. And you see here some of those children at the Manzanar Children's Village, where roughly 1 in 5 of those children were of mixed race backgrounds, very possibly abandoned due to social pressures from both the Japanese and non-Japanese sides of their family. Generally, since most of the mixed race children were third generation or Sansei children under the age of 7, their incarceration is one of the most flagrant examples of the absurdity of the U.S. government's claim that anyone with even a drop of Japanese blood represented a threat to national security. Despite the complex racial dynamics of the period, though, many Japanese Americans, including Hampa Japanese Americans, volunteered to serve in the U.S. military. The segregated Japanese American 100th Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, served in the European theater, even earning the moniker the Purple Heart Battalion for their valor in battle. Hampa Japanese Americans from Hawaii, such as William Kato, Robert Kapuani, Jesse Oba, all of whom were half Japanese, half Hawaiian, Alvin Planas, half Japanese, half Filipino, William Gu, who's pictured on the right there, half Japanese, half Chinese, and Ed Nishihara, half Japanese, half Portuguese, volunteered eagerly for this battalion. And Virgil Westdale, another Hampa Japanese American born into the Nishimura family, who changed their family name from Nishimura, West, and Mura, Dale, to Westdale, served with the 442nd after being removed from his position as a flight instructor in the Air Corps after Pearl Harbor. He served in this unit as it saved the Texas Lost Battalion in France, broke through the Gothic Line, and ironically, given that so many Japanese Americans were in these internment camps in the United States, liberated the Nazi death camp of Dachau. Let me conclude. This paper has highlighted how Hapa Japanese Americans have been integral to almost all the key moments in early Japanese American history. The pioneer settlements, community development, especially in labor history, challenges to racially biased laws around citizenship and marriage, and the World War II incarceration and military service. Many of these themes of inclusion and exclusion, of assimilation and resistance to assimilation, of name and visage changes, of abandonment and belonging, all continue into the post-war period. And as the community looks forward, I would like to suggest that we look at someone like Jero, known here in Japan as a well-known enka singer. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the U.S. Census data shows that in the next several years, the Japanese American community will become majority multiracial. And Jero, on different occasions, has identified as Japanese American, but also as black, and sometimes as Hafu, and sometimes as Hapa, refusing to delimit his identity to one thing. And Japanese America will likely involve many more people like Jero, born and raised in Pittsburgh by his Japanese grandmother and his half-black, half-Japanese mother. My point today is that while someone like Jero, who is only 1/4 Japanese, will increasingly constitute a future Japanese America, such mixedness extends into the distant past, indeed, to the very earliest point in Japanese American history. Thank you.